The forced resignation and arrest of President Otto Perez Molina of Guatemala followed the departure of many others in his administration. In addition to his vice president, several of his cabinet members, secretaries, and ministers also resigned. All this indicates the seriousness of the political crisis. Joining me to discuss the political situation in Guatemala, as well as other countries in Latin America, is our political analyst, Laura Carlsen. Laura, welcome to the show. You know, we saw the protests in Guatemala, the pressure brought on by the people there. So what does this tell us about the state of the nation and the mindset of its people?
Well, essentially, it tells us two things. The report and the indictment against Perez Molina and the fact that he was forced to resign shows that between the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala of the United Nations and the federal prosecutor, they have amassed a tremendous amount of evidence against the president and to reveal this whole corruption framework that existed there. Now, when this came out, the people were indignant for basically two reasons. First of all, to see this laid out, the degree of corruption that was taking place within their government in a poor country where those millions and millions of dollars that are reputedly have been stolen by government officials could have gone to much better use, evidently, in solving the tremendous problems of poverty, and secondly, because of the arrogance of the government. So what this is showing us is that Guatemala is facing a very weak situation of both democracy and governance. First of all, it's revealed a moral and a political bankruptcy that has enraged the populace and forced them to take the streets on a regular basis to call for the resignation of the highest officials of the land. It's also showed us the degree of infiltration of organized crime. Organized crime is not only a few bad apples in some parts of the country, but basically puts up its own candidates, it finances campaigns, and it has formed its own construction companies, for example, to take government contracts. And then finally what it shows us, and this is kind of the positive part of it, is that the Commission Against Impunity is a vital tool for any nation, and especially in the case of Guatemala, to fight against corruption. If it weren't for the independent investigations that took place there, we wouldn't have this information, the population would not know about the corruption schemes that were going on, and we wouldn't see this purging of government officials to root out the corruption that exists.
Well, what evidence did investigators have in order to indict and imprison the president?
Well, essentially, Elaine, the evidence that was presented by the federal prosecutor at the hearings after the resignation of Perez Molina and when the legal process began consisted of phone conversations that have been taped over the past months because this investigation has been going on for quite a while. What those phone conversations revealed was a scheme called Linea, or the line. And this refers to a telephone line. And the prosecutor laid it out like this. He said, basically, importers trying to import goods into the country arrive at the border or the port of entry, and they're required to pay tariffs, and they're required to go through a lot of red tape. So this group offered to these importers to expedite the process by receiving a bribe, essentially, from the exporters to get their goods into the country. They estimated that they took in millions of dollars through this scheme and that the cut of Perez Molina himself was some $800,000.
Former Guatemalan President Alfonso Portillo pleaded guilty to attempting to launder $2.5 million in U.S. banks. He was released from prison, and now he is trying to re-enter politics. Is that possible?
Unfortunately, it is possible. And former President Portillo is really an excellent case of the contradictions in corruption within these countries. He has a lot of political baggage. He spent time here in Mexico and was actually accused of murder. He was then extradited to Guatemala, where he was accused of corruption. He was extradited to the United States and finally pled guilty on what appears to be a plea bargain for receiving a Taiwanese bribe and then seeking to launder the money. He spent only a few months in prison and returned to Guatemala and now thinks he can enter back into politics. Up to now, a citizen committee has refused to accept his candidacy because there is a certain standard that requires candidates to pass a level of honesty and reliability as citizens before they can be candidates, but you never know if that will actually hold. The political system in Guatemala, as revealed by the case of Perez Molina and Linea, is highly controlled by a political elite that's looking out for its own interests. And it's always a possibility that someone like Portillo, despite having a conviction behind him, could return to politics.
Laura, I want to get your take on this UN report. It states that 25% of the campaign funds for Guatemala's politicians are given by criminal operations. Do you think that number is realistic, and are you surprised by it?
I'm not surprised by it. The report is a very harsh indictment, and it could be just the tip of the iceberg because it's very difficult to track these kinds of things. They say not only that 25% is from organized crime, but the majority is from drug traffickers. In addition to that, some 50% is from contractors, both illegal and legal contractors. So there's a quote within the report that says the majority of financing to Guatemalan political parties is from illicit sources. That's an extreme case of capture of the political system by organized crime and by shadow powers. And unfortunately, it's something that we see not only in Guatemala, but in countries throughout the continent. This report needs to be looked at very carefully, as the Guatemalans are doing right now with the legal processes against the members of the Perez Molina cabinet, and it needs to be looked at carefully in the other countries. As I mentioned, this is a tool that many countries don't have, that every country should have, because in other countries where there may be as much corruption, there's no way of tracking it in this way, and it needs to be taken advantage of, and it needs to be replicated throughout the region.
Well, as you mentioned, some of Guatemala's neighbors are facing similar issues. Former El Salvador President Francisco Flores is accused of misappropriating $15 million of public funds. What happened in that case?
Well, in this case, and it also related to a Taiwanese bribe, and it also may just be the point of the iceberg. He is a member of the conservative Arena Party. He initially fled after the accusations took place and then decided to come back and voluntarily present himself. Now, the government of El Salvador is determined to go through with this prosecution. They've delayed the prosecution till November. It was supposed to take place now, but that is in order to broaden the investigation, which may end up even revealing more corruption than was originally thought. He could face a sentence of up to 23 years in prison, and this is the first time in El Salvador that an ex-president has been brought to trial on corruption charges.
Do you think, Laura, we are just seeing much more corruption, or do you think it's just becoming more exposed because of all the information that is available out there?
Well, you know, it's hard to say, but I think both are true. So there's reason for celebration and there's reason for lamentation. On the one hand, the degree of corruption is overwhelming. And whether it's more or less than in the past, we don't really know, because there weren't the kind of tools that we have today for being able to dig into the corruption that exists in government. And in some ways, there's a different attitude on the part of the population as well. I know here in Mexico, after 71 years of authoritarian rule, there was a very cynical perception that this is just what politicians do. And in the Central American countries, where military dictatorships were beyond the pale in terms of responding to population pressures, I think there was a sense that nothing could be done about it either. Now, in most of our countries, we have fairly effective freedom of information laws. We have journalists who are taking their work more seriously, and although there are, as we know, attacks against them, they have a certain bandwidth in order to express what they find in investigative reporting. And we have a population that's not going to take it lying down anymore. They've been in the street in Guatemala, they've been in the streets in Mexico, which is another case worth mentioning, where President Peña Nieto has also been investigated for corruption. And instead of having a commission, as they did in Guatemala, to get at the truth, he handpicked his own committee that cleared him of all charges. There's a case also in Honduras where people have been protesting on a regular basis because of primarily the draining of the Social Security system by the politicians, a situation that enriched the politicians while potentially, or they claim, leading to the deaths of hundreds of citizens unable to get medicines. So we see that it's extremely widespread, but we also see a different attitude on the part of the population. So they've been able to push these legal processes forward, often with the reluctance of the political systems and the people involved, not only the people who are accused, on the one hand, and there's some brave prosecutors that have to be recognized for that, but on the other hand, probably the main ingredient to breaking open these cases that we're seeing today has been the mobilization and the indignation of the populations themselves.
All right, Laura Carlsen in Mexico City, thank you so much, as always, for joining us on America's Now.
America's Now